Well, before we talk about the comedian drag queen who's now become president of Ukraine, which is a story for the ages, frankly, suggesting that the Russians will lose in Ukraine is tantamount to suggesting that if we intervened in northern Mexico, that we would lose in Mexico. No, we're not going to lose in Mexico. We can't. We're going to do pretty much whatever we want and stay as long as we like. I think that's the case for Russia and eastern Ukraine.
Without further ado, I want to bring on our guest. It's the one, the only former U.S. Army colonel and former Pentagon senior advisor, Douglas Macgregor. We've reacted to numerous of his brilliant, bits of commentary on the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I'm very stoked to have him here today. And here we go. Colonel, how you doing?
Threats today, so I'm in pretty good shape.
Great. Glad to hear that. So listen, we've followed your commentary. We've seen all of your segments on Tucker Carlson. You've been doing an incredible job. I think personally, though, I'm sure you've angered a lot of people in the Beltway. I'm curious first to get your opinion on how things have panned out in your eyes in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, because we were following what you were saying even back when you were on Pushback with Aaron Mate back in January, before all of this took place. And you were one of the only people that I really trusted that was predicting a Russian invasion. So how have things panned out compared to what you thought was going to take place in Ukraine?
Again, I looked at both sides of this and I couldn't come away with a certain conclusion one way or the other. There were things that didn't make a lot of sense. A lot of these people had this white armband tied around them. The white armband was a signal to the Russian army that, look, I'm not part of the Ukrainian army. I don't support it. Effectively, I'm not in the war. And all of a sudden, large numbers of those people are dead. We do know that Ukrainian forces have killed people like that elsewhere. They've assassinated mayors, people have disappeared, and so forth. But again, that I'm not saying that happened. I don't know. And my experience in the Balkans when I was involved with the air campaign and then earlier in Bosnia in 95, the Finns were a very good source of investigative scientists, medical people. They would get in and they could tell you the truth. And what the Finns told you, you could believe. But the two sides involved rarely. And I'm not putting much trust in what either side says right now in Ukraine. You know, I was looking at all the figures that are being supplied to people about all the equipment that supposedly the Ukrainians have destroyed. It sort of reminded me of the last election, when more people voted than are registered to vote in the United States. I mean, if you believe all of these figures, I think you wiped out a substantial portion of both armies in terms of the figures. I don't buy it. I'm just very skeptical of all these things. Mm-hmm. And right now, you have masses of troops surrounding this Ukrainian mass that remains in southern Ukraine. How will that turn out? I don't know, but I would suspect that the Russians can probably annihilate it. How they will do it is it's up to them. You know, in 1944, when the Russians cut off and surrounded 50,000 German troops in what we today call White Russia near Minsk, they backed off, they surrounded it, and they brought in air power, 5,000 aircraft. And most of the German troops in the field could not break out because they were surrounded by armor, and they were killed. I guess we could see something like that happen. The Russians can do it, and now they have much more accurate munitions in many cases that they haven't used a lot of, but they could use down in southern Ukraine. I don't know. I think we're going to have to wait for events to dictate the outcome. But I really think this war will end when Putin decides to end it, not at any other point in time. And right now, he sees no reason to end it, given the attitude that he's encountered at the negotiating table.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the negotiating table, we know that, you know, figures within the U.S. deep state have invested loads of resources, money, time, energy into creating a Ukrainian vassal state. I mean, they helped lead a coup against the, albeit slimy and corrupt, but democratically elected leader in Ukraine in 2014. I'm curious what you think about the Biden administration and more specifically the Biden family. As this Hunter Biden laptop story begins to make its way out into the press, we're beginning to see a lot of corruption that is on full display from the Biden family, Hunter Biden, presumably Joe Biden, that took place between themselves and business ventures in Ukraine. Do you think that this is significantly muddying the water and creating a foggy environment and maybe even making people like Joe Biden act a bit unhinged and acting more with, his pocketbook than his brain when it comes to bringing about a reasonable solution to the current war in Ukraine through diplomatic means, negotiations?
Well, as a general proposition, I must tell you that I have the impression that most of the political leaders in Washington on the Hill tend to think of themselves as largely immune to prosecution for almost anything. And they have all sorts of insider deals for themselves regarding everything from medical care to stock investment that go on all the time. And it all seems to happen beyond the pale, if you will, of what is right or what is wrong under the law. I don't know. And I think it was this Congressman Cawthorn, maybe his name, from North Carolina, in the wheelchair, who detailed to people that he'd been brought to something that was effectively an orgy or whatever. And I wasn't really surprised. This kind of thing has always tended to fester in these political cesspools over centuries, but you try to hold it in check to prevent it from overwhelming the system and overwhelming the government. When the government is overwhelmed by this sort of thing, you get 3rd and 4th century Rome, total decadence, decay, and collapse. I hope we're not there. But the whole Biden family saga is so distressing when you see some of these photos that come off this laptop, assuming that what we're being shown is real. It's frightening, because I think in most cases, most Americans would conclude that people engaged in that sort of thing should be subject to the harshest penalties possible under the law. But nothing seems to happen. And more important, the media do not seem to be involved. There are a few, but very, very few. And anybody who speaks out is sort of like, well, what are you, a Putin agent? Why? Because I don't want to go to war? Because I'm not interested in joining the Ukrainian fascist league or something?
Yeah.
No, I'm not interested. I'm an American. I don't want to go to war in Ukraine. There's no vital strategic interest that drives our interest in that place. The only interest we should have is to bring it to an end and negotiate an end to it. That much I agree with. The rest of it, no. But if you don't go along right now, you are immediately sort of tarred and feathered with all the usual epithets, accused of, racist, bigot, all this nonsense. This seems to be the standard procedure, but the louder that gets and the more you hear it, the more convinced I am that the whole structure is very weak. This government is not strong. If it were strong, why would they react in those ways? Why would people in Washington behave that way and react in those very defensive ways towards anybody who disagrees with them? So I think we're in a lot of trouble here in the United States, to be blunt, and I don't give a damn at this stage what happens overseas. I care much more about what's happening here. And if we're not careful, the people in Washington are going to wake up and discover that there are a lot of Americans out there who are no longer willing to take it, no longer willing to sit and show up and behave like the sheeple that they are accustomed to. That's much more serious to me than anything happening in Ukraine. But to your point, what is not possible today in Washington? And I think that's the answer to your question about the Biden family. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and it's not necessarily related to Ukraine, but given that you are a former, or you're a U.S. Army colonel, former U.S. Army colonel, and a senior Pentagon advisor to the Secretary of Defense under the Trump administration, I'm curious, you're a real patriot. You speak about these wars in a way that I think reflects the interests of most Americans. We should concern ourselves where necessary and avoid war at all costs if we can. Given that, how difficult was the power struggle within a presidential administration like Trump's, where the man ran on a lot of these anti-war, points and policies? But we know publicly, at least, there have been people within these positions who have, positions like the Syrian envoy, for example, James Jeffries, who've admitted to directly violating Trump's orders and keeping troops where they were not supposed to be kept. I'm curious, just personally, what was your own struggle between these factions within the administration? And was it disappointing to you? Was it shocking, or did you expect this?
Well, the point on Jeffries is critical, because it's beyond just keeping troops where they weren't supposed to be. People actively lied to the president about where the soldiers were or were not. So it got to the point where what came back from the Pentagon was not trustworthy. And I think, President Trump was a person who came to Washington without a lot of political experience. And I think he had notions about people in uniform, senior officers, that were simply false. He thought that if he called in someone that had 4 stars on their shoulders, that he was talking to somebody like MacArthur or Eisenhower or Arnold, any number of people, and that these people were going to tell him the truth, and they were going to do what was in the interest of the country, and they were going to obey orders. And if they couldn't, they would be honest men and say, I can't do that, and I'm going to have to resign. It took him far too long to figure out that that was not the case. Let's be blunt. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when Eisenhower was leaving the White House and he bade farewell for the last time to Kennedy, and they saw each other again because of the disaster in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. But prior to that, when he left, Kennedy said, "You have any final advice, parting advice?" He said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Be a good butcher." And JFK looked at him and said, "What?" He said, "Be a good butcher. If you're going to be an effective commander-in-chief, an effective president, you've got to be prepared to go after people and fire them, get rid of them, even destroy them if necessary, in order to hold the administration accountable, hold it together, and ensure that people are doing what you've told them to do. And he said, if you can't do that, that's all right. Find someone else, put them in the White House and make them your designated butcher. But you've got to do that. Donald Trump didn't fit that. He's one of the nicest persons you will meet. People that see him publicly, they don't necessarily appreciate what a really nice, sincere human being he is. And I think he gave too many people too many opportunities, too much benefit of the doubt too often. Now, if he comes back, maybe that'll change. I hope so. But that is the lesson that you take away from the presidency. And by the way, Clinton was very good at handling those sorts of things. You know, more than one 4-star went away within 24 hours when he ran afoul of the president of the United States. And we need a lot of that right now for the reasons that you've already cited.
Very, very interesting. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for making time. And yeah, we're going to keep following your work and your commentary on all of this. And just before you leave, is there anywhere people can, I know you've got a website, you've got several books that you've written. Is there anywhere where people should follow along with your work?
Well, I've got a website and there's a YouTube channel that somebody set up. The last book I wrote is worth reading. You know, you can do what most West Point cadets do when you buy it and read the introduction and the last chapter and call it quits. But I think a lot of people would find the book interesting. It's called Margin of Victory, and it tries to explain some of the larger issues that spell the difference between victory and defeat. And it's a little different from what you're going to read in most books, because military establishments are successful not because of something necessarily that happens exclusively on the day of battle. They are successful because of what's happened over decades. And that's something we don't understand very well. We think we spend money, we bought military capability. We spend a lot of money, we don't have what we think we're buying.
Well, I look forward to grabbing that and reading through it. So thank you so much again for coming on, and hopefully we can speak again sometime soon.
Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good day. Thanks for watching that episode of The Dive. If you'd like to support independent journalism, be sure to subscribe and consider becoming a member on my Patreon using the link below.